Welcome back. This is week 6, lecture 2, Passive Righteousness, Luther's Theological Discovery. And here we get to the point where it's a much debated issue and a very controversial issue. Namely, when did Luther become the Reformer? That has been like the swinging door for both Protestants and Catholic theologians and historians, of course, because the point is, before Luther became the reformer for Protestants, his theology then was not sufficiently Protestant. It was not sufficiently, as Martin Brecht, one of the major leading Luther scholars of the past century, said, was not sufficiently evangelical. And that is the real turning point. How do we, let's say, demarcate the good Protestant Luther from the still Catholic Luther? Now, for the Catholic side, that swinging door point where Luther became the reformer is the point where he then deviated and became more heretical. So for both confessional sides, whether it's history or theology, this point of becoming the reformer is of central importance for interpreting Luther as a whole. Now, the problem has been made worse, so to speak, because Luther talks about it. He doesn't talk about it at the time that it was happening. He talks about it much later. And the most extensive discussion is, and I'll be talking about this a little bit later on in this lecture, is his preface to the first edition of his Opera Omnia in 1545. Here, Luther goes through the whole controversy, and basically, he says, I don't think my work should be published, um, except for my treatise on the bondage of the will, De Servio Arbitrio, and my small catechism. All the others should be burned because we have much better. Philip Melanchthon's Loci Communes is a much better text to read. But he says, since I realize that they're going to be published whether I want them to or not, I at least want to set the record straight and talk about how it all developed and came about. Now, I talk about this in my Luther book, part of the readings for this week. It's a very kind of technical and complex development and argument, both that I will be making and that has been made, and the historiographical debate has been rather fierce and very long standing. The question is, in 1545, can we accept Luther's reading back about his development as accurate for the actual historical development going forward? Now, he doesn't give us precise date, and that's one of the very difficult things about this preface. And scholars have tried to identify exactly when this happened, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It becomes a real mess. But he very rhetorically discusses the indulgences controversies, discusses his beginning to lecture on the Psalms in Wittenberg, but then he moves kind of progressively backwards. And so it's kind of like he starts here, and then it goes back to the beginning, and then it comes back. And so it's very unclear exactly what the chronological development was based on his preface, to the point where it has been referred to as rather futile to try to date it explicitly. Now, I offer a date and an argument, and that is sometime in December, probably mid to later December. But it could also be earlier December, 1514. Now, my Luther book discusses why that's the case. I'll be addressing some of that today. But this whole debate of this point where he becomes the reformer, he related to his discovery of passive righteousness. Now, there's a couple of problems. Number one, passive righteousness, as Luther discussed it, traditionally has been identified with and equated with justification by faith. That we can't do, I would argue, in many ways, for things of reasons I'll be arguing today. That is one equation. So, did Luther discover justification by faith as his Reformation discovery? The point where he became a reformer standing against Rome? That is one position. Another position is that discovery took place over a series of events, and just in some ways the lack of being able to date it specifically led to scholars saying we have to give up the attempt to date it specifically and realize that Luther had a number of discoveries, but then by 1518 or so, certainly by 1519, he had his discovery and was sufficiently thoroughly evangelical, therefore no longer Roman, because Luther's theological discovery has always too been associated not just with justification by faith, but always associated with and equated with his break from Rome. That time when he said, okay, I am no longer a Roman Christian. I'm no longer following the Pope. I am no longer consider myself within the Roman Church, and I am breaking from that. Now, in my interpretation, as I present in the book, but also here, and in actually next lecture, the first lecture of next week for week 7, these were two distinct and separate events, if we want to call them events, that his discovery of passive righteousness had nothing really to do with his break from Rome. That is the argument. And next lecture, I'll be dealing with his break from Rome. But this lecture then focuses on that first part of it, his discovery of passive righteousness, and what that really entailed and what does it mean. Now, if you think my presentation already is somewhat confusing because of the historiographical tradition and problems, because it is, we're at that point where he becomes a reformer. Did it happen in 1512, which is the minority position over the past 100 years? Or did it not come about until 1518? Is another problem. Another aspect of this problem is that this preface in 1545 is not the only place Luther mentions it. There's at least 2 volumes, maybe even 3 volumes in Luther's works, in the modern critical edition of Luther's works, which are called the Table Talks. The Table Talks are notes that students took. Luther was a monk, but then after his break, the elector actually gave him the monastery to live in. He eventually got married, which I'll be talking about later on, not today, not even next lecture, but we'll get to Luther's marriage, maybe next lecture. I think it will be next lecture, a little bit at the very end, because certainly that was an issue of breaking from Rome. And so he still remained a professor of Wittenberg, still remained a pastor of the church. And students would come and, come over for dinner in what had been the Augustinian monastery and listen to every word he said as the great teacher and master. And they would take notes. So these were called the Table Talks. And Luther scholars have some kind of disagreement about the validity of the Table Talks, because after all, these are not works that Luther put together and said, yes, I give my approvals to publish these. These are student notes. Other scholars, including my doctoral advisor, believe that they were a precious insight into Luther. Now, Luther, if you know anything about Luther, he was he was a mensch, if that means anything to anybody. I mean, he was full of life and vigor. He was crude. He was arrogant at times, as well as being very humble at other times. He could be vulgar. We're talking more about that later. I referenced that a little bit already in the last lecture in terms of his sermon about the devil and eschatology. And I'll be coming back to that later on, I think. Not today, but later on. But maybe today, because that's one of his comments in his Table Talks. The whole point of this is he too refers to his Reformation discovery, quote unquote, as having taken place in hoc cloaca. Now, that is a problem. And I should be saying that, again, my advisor interprets this rather uniquely, and I think he's extremely persuasive. And so this is not me saying this, but I accept his interpretation. Because in Latin, in hoc cloaca means basically on the toilet. And the idea for, let's say, pious Luther scholars of Luther having his theological revelation while sitting and taking a crap doesn't make sense. And Martin Bracht, whom I already referred to, is a great Luther scholar, but a pious Lutheran himself. Said, no, Heiko. We can't think of the reformer having had a theological discovery